Further debate? I recognize the member for Northumberland, Quinte West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today to speak to Bill 34, Security for Courts, Electricity Generating Facilities and Nuclear Facilities Act 2012. During the few minutes allotted to me today, I'd like to speak to the bill, but also to some issues relating to courts and their cost of operation in my riding and across Ontario. Mr. Speaker, how ironic that just this past weekend we saw another instance of this sort of hooliganism and wanton disregard for public and private property during the St. Patrick's Day riot in London, Ontario. Canadians have, for most of my life, believed that those sorts of antics were restricted to parts of the world where there is not the same deeply entrenched democratic values and respect for property rights of others. That's what we thought. But the Premier managed to dispel that belief by hopelessly mismanaging what should have been another routine public safety issue when the G20 meetings were held in Toronto in June 2008. You will recall, Mr. Speaker, that just prior to the commencement of those meetings, the Premier announced that he and his cabinet, in secret and without any prior public debate, invoked Regulation 233/10 under the Public Works Protection Act that, in effect, turned a massive swath of downtown Toronto into a public work. By doing so, he claimed that this would give the police special arrest powers and would ensure that the G20 meeting site was protected inside and outside the fence erected around the site against any untoward activity. Instead of protecting the site, the announcement of these unprecedented police powers simply inflamed the public and gave one more excuse to those who were looking for reasons to protest what they claimed was the oppression of any number of civil rights by one or more of the G20 countries. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the Premier played right into the hands of the protesters and gave them exactly the sort of undemocratic power trips that was the raison d'etre for the protest in the first place. So while I'm pleased that the Premier has seen fit to eliminate the ability his government to replicate the public disgrace of the G20 regulation, it does not excuse his poor judgment in 2010. If the Premier is looking for notoriety, I think his fiscal mismanagement will be enough to ensure his place in the history books of Ontario. He didn't have to emulate the other great example of left-wing liberalism, Pierre Trudeau, and his enactment of the War Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, nowhere in this bill or the comments made by the Liberal members who have spoken to it has there been an apology for the abuse of power and the abuse of the public interest or trust. It is simply unacceptable for a minister of the government to leave the impression before the G20 meetings that the regulation gave the police the ability to enforce a 5-meter exclusion zone outside the fence, when it gave no such authority. It was unseemly for the government to then point the finger to the Toronto police and try to pass the buck, when they knew full well that the information provided to the police had been misleading. This was a major scandal, Mr. Speaker, and the use of this World War II vintage law to round up people during the G20 summit wound up contributing to a major embarrassment for this province and massive property losses to businesses and individuals in the downtown core. Even the chronology of the passage of the regulation contributes to the abusive nature of the government actions. The regulation was passed by the Cabinet on June 2nd, 2010, and it gave the police extraordinary powers of arrest until June 28th, 2010, the day after the G20 summit ended. Well, the new regulation did appear on the provincial online database known as e-laws 1 week before the summit. It wasn't officially published in the Ontario Gazette until July 3rd, 1 week after the regulation expired. So the bottom line was a misleading press release to the media suggesting that the police could demand identification from anyone moving within 5 meters of the fence which formed the perimeter around the G20 meeting site. If they refused to provide identification, they faced arrest, and if convicted under this regulation, could face up to 2 months in jail or a $500 maximum fine. The opposition to this inappropriate action by the government was swift and widespread. No less than the provincial auditor recommended that the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services should take steps to revise or replace the Public Works Protection Act. If the government wants to claim the authority to designate security areas to protect persons, an integrated statute should be created that could be used not only to protect public works, but also provide proper authority for ensuring the security of persons during the events when required. The auditor then went on to question whether it was appropriate to have the guards offer conclusive testimony about the location of security boundaries. He condemned the lack of openness, transparency, and accountability with the means through which the regulation was passed, and he suggested that the public was not properly advised to the true nature of the regulation. The government asked former Chief Justice Roy McMurtry to review the entire Act, which he did, and he reported back with his recommendations in April 2011. Here we are, almost 1 year later, and we are only now just proceeding through second reading of the bill that will respond to the criticisms of the provincial auditor and the recommendations Justice McMurtry and the outrage of the people of Ontario. I think it is a sad commentary on the current government that no previous government had ever abused the powers of the Public Works Protection Act in the 70 years that it had been in effect, Mr. Speaker. No previous government felt the urge to trample on public rights. None of the 14 cabinet ministers had the courage to stand up and decry the misleading and abusive nature of the regulation they were asked to endorse it. Mr. Speaker, I will be voting in favour of this bill, primarily because it is essential that this government be denied the opportunity to repeat the sordid and unseemly actions of June 2010. Protecting our courts, protecting our nuclear plants, and our power generation facilities are all legitimate goals, and I suspect were the inspiration for the passage of the original Public Works Protection Act back during World War II. To suggest, though, that the very realistic fears of the fifth columns and sabotage during the war, during the world war, could possibly be compared with any risk that was facing downtown Toronto is simply ridiculous. We cannot afford to have public libraries limited, even in the face of antisocial threats by the likes of those individuals who participated in the G20 protest. And passing Bill 34 will ensure that more appropriate controls are in place to guarantee that no future government will yield to the temptation to follow the inappropriate example set by this government in June 2010. Before I close, Mr. Speaker, Just want to touch on the courts and the court costs in the province of Ontario. Mr. Speaker, if this government has any concern for municipalities, particularly small and rural municipalities, he will end the downloading of court costs, a process he spent hours decrying when he was in opposition. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.